Good evening. It's here with us Mathew Ehret, a geopolitical analyst and freelance journalist, co-founder of Rising Tide Foundation. So Matthew, good evening. Thank you for your time and your kindness.
Hi.
The title of our discussion is started from a column of yours that I read about the problematic of nuclear fusion, the research of nuclear fusion. And this column of yours triggered some questions from my side. And I want to discuss with you about it, extending our analysis to the current situation. So the first question is this. What is the Green New Deal? In your opinion, is there a secret part of it hidden for general public, or is it really a promise of New Eden on Earth?
Well, it is certainly, it's a bit of both. It is a promise of a new Eden on Earth, but it is a promise that is that will never be fulfilled because the intention is to create the very opposite. The Green New Deal itself, it stems from a reference to the 1933 New Deal that was ushered in by an American president named Franklin Roosevelt. The original New Deal was something which was an important component to ending the period of the Great Depression, which was a 4-year, it was really longer, financial crisis that swept across much of the world, centered in the United States, but also destroyed much of the economies of Europe. And it was orchestrated in 1929 as a controlled blowout of the financial system. The way this worked back then was the 1920s was an age of speculation. So people were gambling more and more with assets they did not have on the markets. They were also gambling with savings accounts and making a lot of returns. And at a certain point, the brokers, who were the ones managing a lot of this speculative casino-like frenzy, were highly in debt. And at a certain moment in 1929, on the same day, all of the broker call loans were called in. So they all had to pay their debts, which quickly forced them to default. And there was a wave, a chain reaction that was a very foreseeable controlled chain reaction that basically destroyed the illusion of wealth and prosperity. And the world went into a collapse. Now, those who were in the know, who orchestrated the bubbles popping, initiated one of the biggest wealth transfers ever seen up until that time in world history. The people around the JP Morgan preferred clients lists, for example, the Rockefeller interests, a lot of the major oligarchs in the United States, they sold their assets early and were able to buy up the physical hard assets, real estate, farming, other things, rail, steel, for pennies on the dollar during the course of the bankruptcies that emerged out of the 1929 period. So what was also happening is there was a preparation in place for a solution to that crisis, which could only happen by psychologically traumatizing the population of the United States sufficiently so that they would abandon their belief in the Constitution, in democracy, in the Republic, and accept fascism as the miracle economic solution that would help them feed their families once more. So a lot of these elites at that time were all supporting financially the rise of fascism in Italy, in Germany, in Spain, in France. And with that was also a science of eugenics. We saw the effects of that with the idea of a policy of killing useless eaters that was already being done on a certain scale in the West, in North America, but it was really done more vigorously by Germany. But this was part of the science of social control, the science of population control, that they needed a fascist type of government to impose because people would never democratically allow this to happen to themselves. This is why the trauma of the Great Depression was needed as a shock therapy. So when Franklin Roosevelt came in as sort of an outsider dark horse candidate who was not supposed to win, there was a major fight in 1932 to bring in an anti-fascist solution. He basically gave it the name New Deal, but what it was a war on the London and Wall Street banks to break up the banks, to put a lot of bankers in jail for causing criminal speculation. J.P. Morgan Jr. was dragged in front of a jury trial to investigate his role in the speculative fraud of the 1920s and beyond. And also there was an initiation of government-directed credit towards large-scale infrastructure, which took some time to begin to really be felt. But the idea was that money and investments were no longer going to be tied to purely speculation, but rather the reconstruction of your lost industries, the building of things that sustain life and that increase the productive powers of society as a whole. So this was a very important thing that is largely obscured. Like the nature of this fight has been written out of history for many Americans. They don't know how this happened. And so, but they know that there's good positive feelings that they get in their stomach. So what the current orchestration of the Green New Deal, which began many decades ago, it was given the name Green New Deal, I think for the first time in 2009 in London, actually, by Lord Adair Turner, I believe, was the first to initiate this as an idea, but it became more prominent in 2018 in the United States and beyond as something which would be based upon a solution to the oncoming collapse of the system and the need to create a new system. But the effect of the Green New Deal, unlike the original in the 1930s, is to decrease the powers of productivity over society. So the investment in green energy grids, windmills, solar panels, things like that. And also the empowering. Under the Green New Deal, you have the private central banks are empowered to have more power than governments, whereas in the original New Deal, it was national governments that were in the dominant position. Today, it's the opposite. And so the effect of going for, it has different names that they've given it to sell it to people, like Build Back Better is one. The Green Initiative, the International Green Initiative is another one that the president of the European Union has initiated, but it's all the same thing. If you really get nations to get rid of their fossil fuels, get rid of natural gas, shut down their nuclear, as we see Germany now really doing, just they're down to their last few reactors and they're going to be completely shut down and completely reliant on renewables, they say, very shortly. If you do that, you are going to destroy the ability of nation states to support their people, because the quality of electricity that one can get from windmills and solar panels is not only ineffective, it's unreliable, it's very expensive. It exists off of hidden subsidies that are very, very large. But the quality of the electricity, of the energy that you get from these things is not sufficient to power industrial steel or any of the industrial activities that modern society requires, which is why they want it, because it will force you to contract civilization. The population levels on the earth will be shut down. And many people who have been miseducated about energy science are going to not understand why their lives are getting worse, because they've just been never properly educated. They think that 1 gigawatt of windmill power is equivalent to 1 gigawatt of nuclear energy, because 1 gigawatt equals 1 gigawatt mathematically. But the quality of the energy is of a completely different magnitude. You cannot do the same quality of work, but they're thinking in mathematical ways, right? 1 gigawatt, 1 gigawatt. It's not the same thing. It's not mathematical. There's a quality above the math that they are not recognizing. So that's how this is going on. And yeah, I would just end it there, that the Green New Deal has been underway now. I would say largely it was put into operation as we know it, as a process beginning in the late 1960s. And it has been accelerating as a process of shifting, creating a paradigm change into moving society from being a producer creative society into a consumer depopulated society that doesn't know how to create anymore.
So there is a hidden part in this Green New Deal.
Oh yeah.
You use a particular term, Neo-Malthusians. Who are these people? Neo-Malthusians, because it is referred to Malthus and his ideas about the growing of a population. But who are these people?
Well, I think it's important to say something for the audience about Malthus. I mean, many people don't know what Malthus was, but the idea was he was originally a thinker associated with the British East India Company in the 19th or even 18th century, who came up with a formula for population control, which was based on the presumption that populations will always grow geometrically and food will always grow arithmetically. And using certain basic calculations like the space of land that is arable, the amount of rate of population growth, he was making the argument that an economist can always foresee when you will reach a population crisis and thus act in advance by reducing populations before the crisis hits, which was why in the British Empire was able to justify the repeal of the Corn Laws in Ireland in the 1840s, which resulted in millions of dead Irish. Calculatedly, this was completely avoidable, but they chose to do this in order to get the effect of shutting down the population growth by starvation in Ireland. They did the same thing in India. They've done the same thing around the world, and this destroyed much of the hope for a better future for many people in the 19th century. Now, the thing was, there was also in the 19th century a belief in technological and scientific optimism that Malthus did not permit into his equations. And we saw a lot of this optimism, this idea that human beings are actually not subject to these Malthusian constraints because we are endowed with creative reason. We can discover laws of nature if we're given the opportunity and the inspiration. And then we can translate those discoveries that happen when you live in hope, when you live in with a creative rigor and intellect. When you have a society that has that type of culture, you make more discoveries, and those discoveries can be translated to new inventions, which allow you to escape the limitations of resource limits and other things, technological limits, what have you. So this disproved in the minds of many people of the 19th century the formula of Malthus, and he sort of became unpopular for a period. But then in the late 60s, after John F. Kennedy was killed and his brother was killed, which we don't have to go into, but if you look at those who were initiating the killing and cover-up of many of these great leaders, including in Italy, Enrico Mattei, who had a great plan for Africa and much of the world, as well as an industrial policy for Europe, they tried to kill Charles de Gaulle like 30 times, but Charles was he was smarter than the other guys. He was able to avoid a lot of assassinations. But what was happening was that the agencies which were killing these great statesmen of the 1960s were also tied to a ideological revival of this Malthusian ethic, where they said the logic was presented to the population that no, maybe John F. Kennedy or Mattei believed that the nation state could be an instrument for initiating new scientific discoveries and technological growth. And we thought, but they were wrong. They were naive. The reality is that human beings themselves are the enemy to nature. And so we saw the growth of certain organizations like Prince Charles, Prince Bernhard, Julian Huxley were founders of an organization called the World Wildlife Fund for Nature. We saw that, and these are the same individuals like Prince Bernhard who created the Bilderberger Group in the 1950s. They also initiated certain things like the 1001 Nature Trust that had many, many leading members of the old European nobility who were founding members, including Canadians like Maurice Strong, Sir Mortimer Bloomfield, who was the head of an agency that was caught red-handed by French intelligence behind the assassination attempts of de Gaulle, and they were banned from France and Switzerland for doing that. And they were also caught behind managing the assassination of John F. Kennedy as well. This is a Montreal-based organization run by Bloomfield, who was a co-founder of the 1001 Nature Trust. He was also a vice president of the World Wildlife Fund under Prince Philip, and they called themselves Neo-Malthusians in the United States. You saw the active rise of these figures under the Trilateral Commission of Zbigniew Brzezinski, Henry Kissinger, David Rockefeller in the 1970s. And Kissinger initiated a policy called NSSM 200 as one shining, ugly example of this new foreign policy for the United States that said, okay, we can use these new computer models that allow us to forecast population crises and then justify, and in NSSM 200, the National Security Study Memorandum 200, authored by Kissinger and declassified in the early 90s, he lays out 15 countries of the global south that are all wishing to have scientific progress, which he says if they do that, the way Japan did, then they will cause a population crisis and they will use the resources under their soil, which are actually in the strategic interests of the United States. And thus he prescribes policies for depopulation on a variety of levels that the US must engage in to keep Mexico, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, Egypt, there are many countries that were listed under a situation where they would be not able to have that progress that their leaders desired. So all of this came out, and it was very much enmeshed with the World Economic Forum. So you had these models, these idiotic growth models that denied the role of creative reason, because in a computer model, you cannot map creative reason. It's something that is not expressible by ones and zeros. So this was entwined at the very early meetings of Klaus Schwab's World Economic Forum, where people like Sir Alexander King and Aurelio Pichet, who is the head of, I think at the time, Volkswagen, who were also the co-creators of the Club of Rome. They presented at the early World Economic Forum Summit, but it had a different name back then. And essentially this was what was the defining new religion of the technocratic elite, that they would now abide by something which was essentially eugenics, but under another name, the science of population control, that defined the next 50 years of our society's existence. With very few, there was some resistance and pushbacks against this by people who were moral anti-Malthusians, but in most of the cases, they were very short-lived, either assassinated or ousted by a coup. So we haven't seen too much resistance really until the last 8-9 years, where we've seen something arise with Russia, China, and many other nations that have recognized the fallacy of this cultish religion of the elite. And they actually are pushing now a new type of operating system that is anti-Malthusian, which maybe later on in the interview we can touch on.
So, said like this, it sounds a bit like the spectre of depopulation, but based on a model that proposed by Malthus, very simple and linear. It is almost a naive approach, but terrible in its effect on the people of country, the people of every day we meet, going to work, to school, etc.
Yes.
How is it possible that a not so vast, a not so great amount of people have so much power? And
that is the question, eh?
And induce so great change. So I think that these people gather in a club and tell, "Hey, John, I want to talk about the problem posed by the growing of the population. What can we do to solve this problem? We must depopulate." Well,
yeah. How do you start that conversation, eh? That's an awkward thing to start. Well, I think that when you look at our world history from this vantage point, because this is not a new phenomenon that just emerged out of World War II. This is not new. This is old. I referenced very quickly the controlled demolition of the economy back in 1929 and the solution, the pre-planned solution of fascism and eugenics as the controlled solution to the crisis that was also created. But it goes back far beyond 1929 too. This goes back, we could see this evidence of this type of social organization by a hereditary elite, which utilizes certain methodologies of control, both of the people, but also of the minds of the people, to get the people to control themselves. There's a certain science of this type of imperialism, which goes back very deep into the past, into the days of ancient Greece, ancient Athens, and before that. So part of, I mean, some of the things that people are very familiar with is obviously techniques of divide to conquer, you know, keep your slaves fighting, keep them hungry, keep them paranoid, keep them ignorant, and keep them fighting each other so that they don't recognize a common interest in stopping the masters who are controlling both sides. This has been something that has been expanded upon in, you know, modern banking, beginning, you know, even in 1,000 years ago, in the lagoons of Venice. Venetian banking houses were already innovating on this, on how to use debt slavery and increasingly speculation, getting people to go into greater modes of debt without creating anything, but that makes them more dependent on something which is above nation states, that can get nation states to fight each other and manipulate them into crusades or into inquisitions or into whatever. So this is something which is investigatable, but what I think a lot of people don't know how to think about too much, which is the most important part, is the cultural and epistemological warfare, which is, you know, you could divide people physically, but you could also divide the mind against itself. You could train people to think in certain ways that gives them the illusion of knowledge without the actual substance. You know, this is something that Plato, if you read the dialogues of Plato, he was always trying to intervene on this to correct people so that they could better understand the difference between having an opinion versus real knowledge. And an opinion might wear the form, the clothing of truth, but if you start scratching it, it cannot be justified by the person who has the opinion. It was put there, it didn't arise from within themselves. It came from outside of them. People are persuaded by a nice speaker or by popular opinion to adopt views that they themselves didn't think about, whether right or wrong. And that is different from the type of knowledge that arises when you make a discovery, when you have a good teacher that brings you not the right answer, but brings you into a state where you can encounter a paradox so the student grapples with a problem, and the teacher might assist the student with posing questions, but he or she never gives the student the right answer. And that's qualitatively different, because then when the student comes to the eureka, the aha, it's theirs, they own it, and they can then wield it and use it in a way which brings them on the path of wisdom. Their power of judgment, their power of seeing beyond the surface of things into the nature of things is then increased. So there is a way that of education which can enhance that, and there is a way of crafting education that will destroy that. It will cripple that, and it will make the mind compartmentalized into states of hyper specialization, where nobody can think about the whole. People are taught to be like, well, if you know, for example, today, if you have a view on, let's say, economics or climate change or energy policy, you will often get this pompous answer from somebody who has been through the, you know, many of, not all, but many of the university indoctrination systems. And they will say, well, why should we believe your opinion when you don't even have a PhD in your field? You just, you know, you cannot be respected. And it's like, yeah, but I have a mind, I can read, I can think. And so people are worshiping the specialization, and they're not thinking about knowledge. So what happens is that people are led to believe that, okay, I know my little part as a cog in a machine, but I don't know what the machine is doing or who runs it, but I do my part well. And that's what gives me my wealth, my money, my prestige, whatever. And when an expert panel tells me to have an opinion, I will have it because they are experts and I must believe them. It doesn't matter if these experts are only a select group who have very nefarious or questionable allegiances or ideologies. That's not you're just told experts have the view, so you must also have that view. And then you become an instrument for the will of somebody who's not yourself. You're not your own person. Some have called this other directed. So I would say today, if you asked, how is this possible that such a few can control so many? First of all, this is not new. This has been, most of human history is like this, has been different variations of this. And most people who are engaged, who are part of this destructive process of depopulation, are not aware of what they are part of. They are engaged in their little part of a puzzle, and only a few, and this is what came out of, I mentioned the Club of Rome, I mentioned Alexander King earlier, the Neo-Malthusian revival, the reconstitution of eugenics after World War II, took on the form of a new type of science of control that was called cybernetics. This emerged out of World War II. It was funded by the Macy Foundation, which was also an organization funding eugenics in the 1930s. And people like Norbert Wiener, John von Neumann, there was groupings who said, okay, looking at systems, they said you could only look, if you want to understand anything, you have to see the world not as objects just floating in a vacuum, but rather as systems, ecosystems, human economy systems, galactic systems. Everything is a system, and that's true. That's correct. But they said the way that you define and manage the system is by presuming that every system obeys closed what's called thermodynamic equilibrium as its natural state. So the idea of entropy, the second law of thermodynamics, that all systems are dying down in a heat death, that there's always less energy distribution to make a system function, kind of like a gas tank. When you put gas in a gas tank and you rev the engine, it's burning gas. That process is leading you towards less and less gas. At a certain point, you will get heat death. And they say, just like the machine, that's what human economies are. That's what ecosystems are. That's what everything is. And it's defined by information. So cybernetics was a science of governance, that became something embedded in NATO, in the OECD. It became embedded by the Rand Corporation and many think tanks into governing structures of the West and also of the East throughout the 1950s and 60s, especially 60s, where only a few, called the helmsmen, were allowed to have a sense of the whole, whereas every other person in a bureaucracy was not allowed to understand what the whole was doing. And this is really what defined the mechanisms for the world reforms undertaken in the late 60s, early 70s, as society moved away from a producer society and into a consumer post-industrial society. That was the new type of governance that was also applied for military affairs, for scientific investments, for energy investments in nuclear. It was all cybernetics. So again, it became a self-controlling system. And that's sort of what we have today with the current batch of technocrats around the World Economic Forum who are promoting things like democracy summits, which have nothing to do with democracy, at all. These are people who actually disdain democracy, but they use the word because most people who are part of their acceptable version of what they think democracy should be, which is controlled by the mob, which cannot see who are the controllers of mob opinion. That is what they want to give people the illusion of freedom, but not the actual power to do anything politically. So they have a very specific type of way of thinking that allows us to be slaves and think we're free, which also involves a cultural component too, of drugs, of other things, which, that's a whole other conversation. Yeah.
One of the masters of these days of ours is the research of quantum computers and artificial intelligence. But someone could ask, how does this kind of research fits into a Neo-Malthusian paradigm? If a population decrease rapidly over a great amount, are really useful quantum computers and artificial intelligence?
Well, there's a view that has been promoted, which is it's a false view. It's provably unscientific, that the human mind is going to be made obsolete by the growth of technological evolution. And this is based on the theory, information theory, which was also something that was generated. I mentioned cybernetics, but also information theory was generated in the 1940s by Norbert Wiener, who had this idea that machine learning is something which will be able to become superior to human brains, because machines can process a greater quantity of information. And because the rate of processing can always increase beyond the speed of calculations of a human mind, it is inevitable that you will have a point whereby the machines will take over, unless we can maybe become human cyborgs or something with brain implants of machines, that allows us to stay relevant, which is sort of what Elon Musk and Zuckerberg talk about with Neuralink and things like that. These are this is what gave birth to transhumanism as an idea. Quantum computing as well is sort of people will spin that same argument as a branch of that. Now, I think that Antonio Guterres, who, I think everyone knows who he is, the head of the UN, had recently made a warning that I thought was very interesting, where he pointed out about 2 months ago in a speech that the world is heading towards what he saw as a great danger of two different paradigms of technology, science, military affairs, political theory, AI, quantum computing. And he says unless we can get everybody on the same page, we're entering a system of two opposing paradigms of these things. What was he talking about? He is a supporter of the Great Reset. He's a supporter of the Green New Deal. He's a supporter of this post-human, post-nation state world order we've been sort of touching upon this whole time. Now, he's also referring to the fact that certain countries of this earth do not wish to go along with this new era of depopulation, referring obviously to Russia, China, and the different nations working with the multipolar Eurasian alliance. Now, in a human society which is productive, which is based on utilizing real technology and improving upon it and applying technology not for only military affairs, but for the well-being of everybody, which is, technology is not a good or a bad thing unto itself, right? Technology is sort of neutral. Is it good or evil intentions which are utilizing that technology for making life better or making life worse for people, right? So in a healthy society, I think that AI, machine learning, does have a certain role to play. It could play a very important role for automation, for space research, automated space research centers on another planet, even maybe in applications in medicine. There's a whole variety of things that this is useful for. Now, machine learning, though, is still limited to deductive and inductive forms of logic. This is computer logic, deductive and inductive, or sometimes some might call it a priori versus a posteriori reasoning. You start with a specific, and then you look for patterns, and then you make a conclusion of something general, or you start with a general rule that you use to guide how you read specific data sets. Either way, it's two different types of thinking that are two sides of the same thing. That's what a computer can do. Human minds can do that, but they can do something more that a computer can't do, because the computer is still limited to what the programmer puts in. A computer cannot discover what is going on in the center of the sun. It cannot discover the higher galactic cycles that have never been discovered, that are shaping the weather systems or other things that are going on the earth. Computers just cannot do that. That requires something that the human mind does when it is being in a fruitful, creative place, right? And it can master data, it can master formulas. That's fine. But once you do that, you have to maintain, like what what Leonardo da Vinci did is a good example of that, is somebody who can leap creatively into higher principled concepts that look into causality of things, where he's able to have a musical quality of mind that governs his technical expertise. And you saw it with Da Vinci as well, and Max Planck, the great scientists, who both of them described in various ways whenever they would hit a logical impossibility in their math, because they were pressing on the frontiers of knowledge, right? They were not just trying to master mathematical formulas for their own career's sake so that they could sound smart. They were pressing on human knowledge on the frontiers of ignorance. And so the math would break down when you do that. And they both described how when they reached those limits, they would go to Mozart. You know, Max Planck was a concert pianist. Da Vinci was a wonderful violinist, and both of them would play together, as many scientists did in those days. They would play Mozart, they would play Bach, they would play, and after a period, they would be saturated with a new type of essence inside of their soul, a musical essence that allowed them to return to their blackboards and come up with creative concepts that provided a harmony to the dissonance of the paradox, right? The paradox is where your mind and reality break down, right? There's something that doesn't fit. And so that's like a dissonance. It's something that doesn't fit, right? Two strings are out of tune with each other. It's dissonant. And so to resolve that, if you really study some of the things like Beethoven's dissonant quartets, there's a lot of dissonance that they introduce into great classical musical compositions, but they're resolved. And when the mind is put into that motion, it can do things that a mathematician could never do and a computer could never do. So that's why I say that the AI replacing human beings, the way transhumanists believe, is founded upon unscientific beliefs and theories, which are more cultish than anything else. And they can only persuade us to go along with it to the degree that we allow our minds to be treated like computers. If we want answers, if we want definitions, we want formulas, we want rules. That's how we're often treated in our school system, right? Is to get the right answer. Don't pose the right question. Then we ourselves are crippled, and we're not able to refute why is the human mind superior and sacred, whereas to any computer. We cannot do it because they make us think like a poor quality computer. So we have to really just recognize that as a way to deal with this idea. But I think otherwise, quantum computing and AI could do a lot of very good things as assistance to human progress.
Let's come to the topic of a column I remember at the beginning of this our conversation, the nuclear fusion research, the hot one, the hot nuclear fusion with high temperature plasma gas, but also the cold. Two parallel sabotages in this field of research. And so there is another question linked to this one, directly linked. Is it possible to abandon fossil fuels without incurring the deliberate murder of part of a human race? A strong depopulation.
Could you ask me that last part? Is it possible to ask me the last part again?
It is possible to abandon fossil fuels without incurring in the deliberate murder of a part of a human race, without doing a strong depopulation.
Yeah, no, you are not able to eliminate fossil fuels without destroying a big part of the human race. As it currently stands, you cannot do it that way. I personally believe scientifically that it is inevitable at some point and necessary at some point that human beings no longer use what are called fossil fuels. And I think that the name fossil fuels is maybe a little silly because there's no actual serious data to demonstrate that fossil fuels actually come from fossilized life, plants or dinosaurs, as we are often told. It's more likely that these come from a process that we have yet to fully discover within the earth, similar to water. People don't have a very good theory of the cause of water, but there's a lot we don't know. I mean, our society is a little drunk on arrogance of what we think we are told we know about what's inside the sun or what's inside the earth, whereas the reality is like we've only penetrated something like 14 kilometers into the crust. And the reality is the crust is like 60 kilometers. We've only penetrated 14 of 60 kilometers. And then below that, there's 2,000 kilometers of mantle and whatever else. And there's another 2,000 kilometers below that. We don't know. We just don't know. But back to this question of fossil fuels, so-called, I think that human beings will eventually not use this for burning for energy. I think at a certain point, as we master the power within the atom itself, because right now fossil fuels are still the molecular burning, right? You're on the molecular level. But as we go down, and we began this a century ago, into the atomic structure itself, we start discovering that the more we know, the more we can understand about the geometries within the nucleus, within the, within all elements and all isotopes on the periodic table. There's a power of matter being transformed into energy that we can harness and deploy for human use, which is of much greater magnitude than anything you can get from burning molecules or chemicals of oil, natural gas, coal. These are superior to burning wood, of course. They were very important for a period, but at a certain point, we have to go to something more superior. Windmill energy, solar power energy, burning bioethanol, biofuels like food, which we burn when people are starving, for gasoline, which is something insane. These are going from a higher order of technology, a higher order of energy density, which is what you get with natural gas, and going to a lower order that allows you to do less work with more effort. That's the very opposite of what economy should be. Economy should be doing more, getting more work, more effect, using less effort. That's healthy economy. That'll always be true. 1,000 years ago, today, or 20,000 years, or 1,000,000 years in the future, that function will always be true. Even though we can only imagine what technologies might exist, 1,000,000 years from now, that will still be true. So what you have with those trying to do the opposite, who are trying to shut down fossil fuels, who are trying to cancel nuclear energy investments. I mean, in the West, we haven't built a brand new nuclear reactor in the West in many, many decades. We stopped doing this in the 80s. Canada hasn't built one since the 80s. The US, same. Only you see new reactors being built by China, by India, by Russia. That makes up already right there over half of the world's new nuclear energy projects. Other than that, most countries have given up in the industrial part of the world. And on top of that, we're being told also get rid of coal, natural gas, other things. So we're defying nature. We're defying the natural economy, the flow of nature, which is already before human beings. We see that there is a directionality, right? Even before human beings entered the scene, looking back to the pre-Cambrian, I like looking at the studies of Vladimir Vernadsky, the great Russian biogeochemist, who he evaluated, looking at the layers of fossil records going back into the past epochs. You could look at the pre-Cambrian epoch about 500 million years ago, and you could see that the biosphere was a much more inactive process. There were very few complex organisms. Mostly it was unicellular organisms, right? And then over time, even though there are these mass extinction periods where biodiversity in the fossil records disappears or regresses, we then see, as we get closer to our present age, we have periods where there's a blossoming of brand new species, new type of biotechnologies are brought online, like photosynthesis, the chlorophyll molecule, the utilization of the sun's light to do work biologically and convert, carbon dioxide into functions that allow for the creation of hydrocarbons, of oxygen, free oxygen that creates the ozone layer. All of these processes are created without human beings. There's already a process of creation that is directed, that allows the flow of what Vernadsky had called the biogenic migration of atoms to increase its cycling over time. So that, a lizard, for example, has lizards were there before mammal life was present. We could see the lizard species earlier on. And the lizard has a much lower metabolic power of transforming food into energy to do work, and so if a lizard is cold, it can't really move. It has to like sit in the sun. An animal has a greater control, a mammal has a greater control of its metabolic activity. It can calibrate its heat more into cold weather. So it has greater freedom of motion, but it also utilizes more of its food into energy than a lizard does. And human beings, we sort of replicate this biologically, but more importantly, intellectually. We discover and apply new discoveries that allows us to have more of our species sustained at a higher quality of life, the way no other animal species can do. As long as we keep on leaping beyond the limits to growth, because every new discovery carries with it limits. You discover how to utilize coal instead of burning your forests. Now, great, you can do more work with coal than with wood burning, but now there's obviously going to be new limits because there's only so much coal. So then you're obliged to discover something better, oil, right? If you don't leap beyond coal, you will enter a population crisis. And the same thing, at a certain point, oil allows you to do more work than coal. But the problem is there's still only so much oil you can discover. So you have to go into the atom, which is what we began doing. And the problem was the Malthusians, who came into power in the early 70s, especially, went out of their way to manufacture the shutdown of our nuclear energy projects. Over half of America's nuclear reactors were shut down, canceled, that were planned to be brought online throughout the 80s. And what they wanted to do is to get everybody into a little cage where they're reliant upon very controlled forms of energy like oil and coal, which were monopolized by the geopolitical, powers that be. This is what Kissinger did by creating the petrodollar in 1973. He basically created a bit of a sleight of hand by moving the dollar off of the fixed exchange rate gold standard that was active until the early 70s, 71. He floated it onto the global markets and then tied the value of the dollar, that was the basis of all international currency, to the price of oil, which was controlled by the OPEC nations, which were themselves beholden to the powers of London and Wall Street. So this has been something which has been I would just call it evil. It's an evil agenda to destroy the new discoveries that were going to be made and were being made into fusion, which was, in many ways, we were closer to discovering fusion power 30 years ago than, at least here in the West, than we are today. And there were people like, I mentioned in the written form of this interview, Robert Bussard, who was the father of nuclear propulsion for space back in working with NASA in the early 60s, late 50s. And throughout the 60s, he was working on nuclear fusion propulsion for intergalactic or interstellar space exploration. And he moved to not only become a pioneer for the creation of ITER, which he recognized was not going anywhere. And it still is not really going anywhere. It's just sucking up a lot of money and time and resources. But he created things like the Bussard polywell as a form of cold fusion utilizing controlled plasmas, which are self-organizing systems. The fourth state of matter is plasma, ionized gases that can be superheated, whereby what we find is that we don't have to force anything to happen. Within a plasma state, there are these self-organizing vortices, solitons. We have processes whereby natural states of creation, of fusion of atoms happens. And there's different approaches to it, utilizing lasers and other things. And he was making a lot of progress in this, overthrowing a lot of the the standard model theories of the atom. And he was receiving funding at a certain point by the US military, which, when he really began producing great results in 2006, all funding was seized up. His discoveries were absorbed into the military industrial complex, and he was iced out of it and died a very sad man. His discoveries were never allowed to be utilized for the benefit of people. And there's many cases like this in biotechnology and in energy policy. So I think that indeed we should have fusion by now. We should have had it already. And we're always being told it's 30 years in the future. Just just long enough that you'll probably be dead. So stop, don't think about it. And it demoralizes people, but it's being sabotaged. Funding is being cut off so that scientists since the 70s have not been able to build the prototypes that they need to build to test their ideas. They're given just enough to like pay their personal bills. But again, it causes these old scientists who had the real knowledge, who are now in their 90s, they're dead, to just die demoralized and not pass on that knowledge to the young who are trained to think in terms of computer modeling, not reality. They don't know how to do great experiments so much in the West anymore. We do see evidence of a revival of this better way of thinking in the East, in Russia and in China, but we don't see a lot of it here in the West. That has to be revived.
Well, let's come to COVID. What do you think about COVID? Now there is a lot of talk about the Omicron variant. Someone thinks that is artificial variant, but that acts like a natural vaccine. So what is this COVID guy?
I know you mentioned to me that you don't want to get this video kicked off of YouTube, and so I'm going to try to be careful with what I say, but I don't know if I can say this in a careful way.
Oh well, let's risk. Let's risk.
Let's risk. Okay. A wise man who was a bit of a mentor for me had once written a book, and in it he gave an example of a way of a stupid way of thinking, and he said every time, let's say there is a band of thieves that hide out in a certain tunnel between two villages, and every time people pass through that tunnel, every single time they get robbed, oftentimes killed. The people in the other village then conclude that passing through that pathway causes death 100% of the time. That's the fraud of statistics. And so you see how nobody was actually thinking about the actual bandits themselves who were operating in there. They just thought, oh, it's the act of passing through the passageway that does it. Statistics, Bill Gates had a book that he said was one of the most influential books for him, called How to Lie with Statistics. And statistics themselves are something which are useful. You know, we cannot do much without utilizing statistics, but to make statistics govern how our minds make conclusions is the great way that you can get society to acquiesce to genocide. You can do more, as I think it was John Perkins, the person who wrote Confessions of an Economic Hitman. He once said you can do more damage with an economist writing something with a pen than you can with thousands of hired mercenaries. You can cause more death that way.
Yes, it is true. Let's see to the economic situation in Greece, for example, and what happened when economists take the country into account. So I
yes, exactly.
Your point of view. I understand perfectly.
Yeah, exactly. So here we are. What is a COVID death? What does that mean? When you actually start asking people, you start looking for how do they define these deaths? Why are there deaths anyway that are being attributed to this thing we call COVID? And you start seeing that pretty much everybody going into the hospital for 2 years now, I'm feeling sick, I've got a breathing difficulty. Increasingly, what we've been seeing is they're registered as being, COVID positive, even if they went in for something totally that wasn't COVID. They had a broken leg, they fell off a ladder. But once you're in the hospital, they give you a PCR test, and if they label you as COVID, and if people die with a heart attack and they've been declared COVID positive, it's been labeled by protocols put down from the top by the World Health Organization that you must be declared a death by COVID on your death certificate. Autopsies have stopped here in Quebec, where I live. They have not done autopsies on people who have died of COVID since the beginning. Why? What are they trying to hide?
I beg your pardon. You said no autopsy in Canada, for example, or United
In
States?
Quebec, I don't know. I have to verify if all of Canada, but in Quebec's case, yeah, they have not been doing autopsies on COVID patients.
No, the same in Italy. The same
Same in
in
Italy,
Italy.
yeah.
The first
Hmm.
autopsy on people dead apparently by COVID, people, of course, under forced ventilation. The first autopsies were made by a very old doctor, close to the retirement age, and almost illegally. Italian government never prevent hospitals and doctors from doing the autopsy, but the government declare autopsy are not suggested. So in Italian public administration, when you read this thing is not suggested or strongly not suggested, is equivalent as a negation. So none at the beginning did the autopsy.
Yeah, exactly. No, this has been endemic. We've seen cases of this all over the United States, all over much of the Western world. And, there's so many ways that data sets have been manipulated, artificially controlled, and crafted by things like Our World and Data, which provides the majority of the data sets utilized by NGOs, by national governments, by the World Health Organization, and then turned into policy top down that are then embedded in the administrative levels bureaucratically in every hospital as protocols that are not tied to any reality. These data sets are artificial. And you could use, again, statistics to justify anything you want. You could justify why a molecule called carbon dioxide is somehow causing a warming of the planet, which is not even happening, let alone it has no relationship as being caused by carbon dioxide. But you can utilize correlations of statistics and just selectively cherry pick what you like that fits the conclusions you want the computer models to spit out, to then justify a mass behavioral modification of a target population in conformity with a system of controls by an empire. This has been something, again, that's been going on for a long time. It's been more refined, but it's the same techniques utilized by empires long past. And I would say, yeah, COVID has been something that is no different, and it is largely covering up the blowout of the financial system, which was going to happen without COVID. The financial system was going to collapse. So it's like, even if there was never going to be a return to normal, because the whole system was always a ticking time bomb set up originally in the early 70s to be a time bomb for a controlled demolition like it was in 1929. This sort of ties us back to the beginning of where we started. 1929 was a similar time bomb created in the 20s of a bubble, and bubbles pop and they can be controlled to be popped. The difference today is that, unlike in 1929, we actually have a coalition of strong nations representing different ancient civilizations, cultural matrices, who have all organized a common bond of survival in opposition to this anti-human agenda. So this is something that the past we never experienced, this type of coalition of forces this way, who are putting online policies somewhat similar in principle to what we saw coming out of Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal, the real New Deal in the 1930s, that involves forcing the monetary system to abide by the higher laws of human need, of investments into 5, 10, 20-year projects, which improve and uplift people from ignorance and from scarcity into a state of having knowledge. Like in the case of Franklin Roosevelt, the Tennessee Valley area, if you look at the Tennessee Valley Authority, which was one of the biggest drivers of the New Deal, had about, the statistics were about a 29% literacy rate in the late 20s. And by 1950, that had gone up to an 89% literacy rate. And it became a driver of the aerospace industry because of all of the hydroelectric dams that were built up along the water systems, which were formerly causing mass flooding. It was like hillbilly stuff, Beverly Hillbilly stuff, total ignorance. So it was transformative in that way. And it was all because the monetary investments were tied to a broader intention which transcended the limitations of the monetary system itself. And so when you look at the Belt and Road Initiative today, the new Silk Road, and the types of, I mean, we're talking mega projects here, multi-trillion-dollar transgenerational projects that are occurring all across Eurasia, into the Middle East, with rail, all sorts of anti-desertification projects, hydroelectric, nuclear power, high-speed rail, magnetic levitation rail, including investments all over Africa that are very different from the sorts of things that we have been seeing for the, under the IMF or World Bank. It's a totally different paradigm. You cannot measure what is going on there using any of the standards of economic theory that we are dominated by in the West. It's a different thing completely. And it's more ironically in alignment to the sorts of things the West used to do before JFK was killed. So, I would just say it that way. It's a clash of two different paradigms in that sense. But yeah, COVID is completely designed to cover up the reality of that blowout that's happening. And the reason why they have not been able to usher in the bankruptcy yet is because it is understood that with the coalition of Eurasian forces being what they are, that many of the countries trapped in the geopolitical cage of the City of London, Wall Street dominated Five Eyes, complex would increasingly jump happily into an alliance with the Belt and Road and with the Eurasian Alliance. Greece, Portugal, Spain, many of these countries would do it quickly. And they, the oligarchy is afraid of losing that quantity of its victims to that other alliance. So they're trying to right now create a cage, sort of a new Iron Curtain, a new Cold War. This is what the Democracy Summit a month ago was all about. Was saying, half the world is not invited to our special club of good democracies. They're all bad authoritarian governments. They're not going to be invited. And they're trying to provoke Russia. They're trying to provoke China into acting aggressively in the case of Taiwan or Ukraine, which will then justify a complete shutdown of trade and communications like it was in the Cold War, so that they can then consolidate their controls in the West and try to play a longer game of subversion, cultural subversion, targeting the younger Chinese, the younger Russians, culturally, video games, all other things like that will weaken them in the next generation, where they could maybe be subverted in a decade or so. So that's currently the calculus, but I don't think that it can win. I think they're using COVID as an excuse to sort of try to stay in control of the blowout and the response to it. But I think that the creative vitality and superior paradigm of the Eurasian system is beyond what these technocrats are capable of subverting. That is my belief. We'll see.
Well, this answer of yours introduces my last questions about Russia, China, and a few other countries, but do not seem to be following a depopulation script. Russia is building up again its power, so China with amazing scientific result. The question is very simple. Are Western elites simply committing suicide in their madness?
Sort
this
of.
Is the last question of interview.
Yeah, okay. Sort of. I think that there is something in there is something to be said for the quality that we see in many cases of great literature. There's something fatalistic within the oligarchical system of being. Anybody who thinks in a master-slave way has implicitly a sort of fatalism about them. And if you make it too much of you and of what your system is going to be defined around, it will always destroy those trying to parasitically suck a host. Because that's what an empire is. An empire is kind of like a parasite that latches onto a host and just suckles like the host until the host gets weaker and weaker and ultimately dies. Now, the problem for a parasite sucking on a dead host is that the parasite will die too. And we've seen that with the collapses of many civilizations which were not able to purge the parasite in time, and the civilizations went into decline, decay, corruption, war, division, insanity, and collapse. And that's where this human history is unfortunate. Just like the fossil records are littered with these cases of mass extinction, these species that just were not able to make it. Human civilizations are sort of are defined by these cases of societies that were not able to make it, to make the creative shift. So the oligarchy is not able to really create anything new and true. They're able to maybe at the best steal ideas that are made by creative minds and try to use them destructively to advance their agenda. They can use electricity, and they can use it to maybe power, concentration camps and all sorts of things that are very bad, and, weapons manufacturing companies, but they cannot, there's nothing within the oligarchical mode that allows them to discover the nature of electricity the way Benjamin Franklin did in the 1750s. So I think in that sense, you are dealing with a system which is in defiance of discoverable natural law. That is, the laws that are built into the fabric of physical space-time that human minds can be, and minds and hearts can be in accordance to. And when we are utilizing our free will, because we're a creature of choice, not a creature of necessity in that sense. We're not fatalistic, we're not deterministic. We can choose to not be ourselves. A bird can only be a bird. A human being can choose to not discover its wings or not believe that it has wings, and just stay on the ground. I don't want to give people a sense that we actually have wings, but I'm saying that metaphorically speaking, we can be convinced that we don't have creativity. And so the empire, yes, I think that by virtue of its necessity under the Malthusian ethic, the oligarch must crush creativity in science, in great classical art. It must smother it. So every time there's like a fire that goes off of new discoveries, they must smother it. It's very time and energy intensive to do that. It's very unnatural to do it, and it destroys their own foundation for existing. Because just to be very clear, it's a scientific fact that at some point, asteroids are going to slam into the Earth, and they will cause a lot of destruction. We are in a very fragile part of the galaxy around a certain sun that there's billions and billions of rocks, some small, some very big, and some of them are comets that are moving in and out of our solar system, that we haven't discovered most of those. And we know by our fossil records that some of them do hit periodically, and they cause mass destruction of everything. If you have a Green New Deal, let's just say we go for transhumanist, post-government, post-nation state, systems as the solution to the oncoming economic collapse. So we've done it. We've reduced the world population to maybe 1 billion people, the way computer models say is sustainable. We've got windmills and solar panels everywhere. We've shut down all of our nuclear reactors. Great. Okay. Let's say now, 50 years in the future, as it will be the case at some point, we discover now an asteroid is on collision. What do you do? How many windmills can we deploy to shoot a laser beam sufficient in power to destroy the asteroid or change its trajectory? Zero. It doesn't matter how many windmills and solar panels. You will do nothing but wait and die, like the oligarchy would. So just on that level alone, I think the oligarchy itself is doomed for extinction like the dinosaurs. They're not able to adapt to a higher reality, which has brought itself into our reality. China and Russia and other nations are moving on a very future-oriented perspective. I mean, they've got cooperative projects to do asteroid defense in a serious way, to put government backing behind developing a China-Russia joint space moon mission for a moon science base within a few years. They have projects all over that are just so cutting edge, so frontier. It's not just in the military side of things, but I mean, on fusion power, there are things that are happening that are so positive. It would make you cry out of happiness when you look at it. In terms of magnetic levitation trains that are being built up all over right now. There's plans to have something like 500% more increase of magnetic levitation. where, I mean, you're traveling in the most scientifically advanced way at speeds, even just high-speed rail. We don't have any in Canada. The US has hardly any. In China, they've got 30,000 kilometers built in less than 10 or 12 years. It's crazy. No, sorry, 20 years, but still, I mean, it's crazy. These are all sorts of things which would allow humankind to make the leap to become what we are. There's a battle to keep us from becoming what we are as a species of self-conscious, loving, creative reason, right? That's what we are. That's how we're happy. And that's when we are being human. So the oligarchy is trying to keep us in a state of something very unnatural, something very bestial, in alignment with the laws of the jungle, right? That's Hobbesian zero-sum thinking. It's basically just fight over diminishing returns in a world of alphas, you know, like the alpha of the pack controlling the deltas and the omicrons. The alphas are trying to control the omicrons.
Yes,
that's funny.
Omicron.
Yeah, you can use that if you want. But so that's not how human beings. We are not a species of the jungle. We are a species of sublime civilization. And so when you look at the great art of Mozart, of Da Vinci, of Beethoven, of Bach, of Plato, and you look at the discoveries of Max Planck, who discovered the quantum world and really made it accessible to human minds. It's a different, more beautiful Renaissance paradigm, which you see in every culture. I mean, there's examples of this Renaissance spirit in ancient Indian culture. You see this with Rabindranath Tagore, the great Indian philosopher and poet, who really embodied this. You see it in China, in Confucianism. You see this all over the world. In Africa, I mean, Africa has a deep, long tradition which has been scrubbed out by the imperialists, which goes back thousands and thousands of years to great civilizations that have been wiped out of our historical record by the British, the Belgian, the other colonialists. But this is all what we need to rediscover and bring to the fore of what makes human beings human. And that's what the empire is truly afraid of, I think. And that's why they're really afraid of the current Iran, China, Russia alliance, which is it's finally stabilizing the Southwest Asia region. It's providing a zone of hope and optimism for Africa for the first time ever, and for much of South America too. So, you know, we just have to keep doing what the empire is afraid of, I think.
Well, thank you. That was the last question of our conversation, a quite a long conversation, and I really thank you for your time, your kindness, and I wish you a very good 2022 years. I hope that the next year will be better than the last one. But unfortunately,
it will definitely
I'm
be
not very sure. I'm not very sure that it will be true, but let's hope.
It will definitely be a character building experience. Whatever the case may be, it's an opportunity to build character. So think of it that way.
Okay, thank you very much. See
Thank
you
you.
in the future for maybe a new conversation in the next year.
Most certainly.